the sound of Brenda Hutchinson's designer heels clicking against the asphalt as she was escorted off her property by two sheriff's deputies, still echoes in my mind. She was clutching a Louis Vuitton bag in one hand and an eviction notice in the other, mascara streaming down her face as she screamed about lawsuits and constitutional rights. The same woman who'd spent months trying to destroy my family's century-old cattle ranch because she claimed we had too much land was now being forcibly removed from her own home. And the twisted irony of it all started with a single phone call she made to report me for something that would ultimately expose her own illegal activities. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a third-generation rancher in Cedar Valley, Texas. 6 months ago, I inherited 470 acres of prime grazing land from my late Uncle Henry. The property had been in our family since 1893, back when this area was nothing but wild prairie and the occasional homestead. Now, half of it bordered the prestigious Sunset Ridge Estates, a gated community where the houses started at $800,000 and the HOA fees could pay someone's mortgage in a normal neighborhood. That's where Brenda Hutchinson entered my life like a designer-clad tornado of entitlement and misplaced authority. As the HOA president of Sunset Ridge, she ruled her domain with the kind of iron fist that would make dictators take notes. I'd heard stories from the locals about her legendary pettiness, fining residents $500 for having their trash cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours, forcing a disabled veteran to remove his wheelchair ramp because it wasn't the approved shade of beige, and even measuring grass height with an actual ruler during her weekend patrol walks. The first time I encountered Brenda was 2 weeks after I'd moved onto the ranch. I was out fixing a section of barbed wire fence that ran along our shared property line when I heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive engine purring to a stop. A white Mercedes G-Wagon pulled up, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd walked straight out of a Real Housewives casting call. Platinum blonde hair, styled to perfection, a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my truck, and sunglasses so large they could have doubled as satellite dishes. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that somehow managed to be both shrill and condescending at the same time. "Are you the new owner of this establishment?" I straightened up, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my work glove. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Jake Morrison. Just took over the ranch from my Uncle Henry. Can I help you with something?" She removed her sunglasses with a dramatic flourish, revealing eyes that were already narrowed in disapproval. "I'm Brenda Hutchinson, president of the Sunset Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I'm here to discuss the numerous violations your property is committing against our community standards." I had to bite back a laugh. "Violations, ma'am? This ranch has been here since before your grandparents were born. We're not part of your HOA." Her perfectly lined lips pursed into a thin line that may be, "Mr. Morrison, but your property directly impacts our residents' quality of life. That barn," she pointed a manicured finger at our 100-year-old cattle barn, "is a complete eyesore. The color is all wrong. It clashes horribly with our approved earth tone palette. The barn is red," I said slowly, wondering if I was being pranked, like most barns have been for the past 2 centuries. Exactly my point. It's garish and outdated. I'm going to need you to repaint it in either Sahara beige or Tuscany taupe. I have the color swatches in my car if you'd like to see them. I leaned against the fence post, trying to process the audacity of this woman. "Mrs. Hutchinson, I appreciate your concern, but my property isn't subject to your HOA rules. This is agricultural land, and that barn stays red." Her face flushed, clashing with her carefully applied bronzer. "We'll see about that. Mr. Morrison, I have connections at every level of local government. If you won't voluntarily comply with reasonable requests to maintain property values, I'll find ways to make you comply." She spun on her heel and marched back to her Mercedes, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt with each step as she drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that probably horrified her. I had no idea I'd just made an enemy who would dedicate the next several months to destroying everything my family had built. True to her word, Brenda launched what could only be described as bureaucratic warfare. Within a week, I received my first official complaint. She'd reported me to the county zoning department, claiming I was running an illegal commercial operation in a residential area. The zoning inspector who came out was a good old boy named Bill who'd known my uncle for years. He took one look at our deed and agricultural exemption status and shook his head. "Jake, I'm sorry about this," Bill said, leaning against his truck. "That woman has called our office 17 times this week. She even sent a 30-page document with photographs of your cattle, claiming they were evidence of commercial activity." "She took pictures of my cows?" I asked, incredulous. "Oh, it gets better. She used a drone to get aerial shots of your entire property, had measurements and everything, claiming you were exceeding some kind of land use quota that doesn't even exist. My supervisor made me come out here just to shut her up. I offered Bill a cold beer from the cooler in my truck, which he gratefully accepted. So what happens now? Now I file my report saying everything is perfectly legal and has been since before the county even had zoning laws. But between you and me," he lowered his voice, "this won't be the end of it. People like her don't give up easy." Bill was right. Over the next month, Brenda filed complaints with every agency she could think of. The health department showed up, claiming she'd reported unsanitary conditions from livestock. They found my operation exceeded all standards, and even complimented me on the cleanliness of our facilities. The inspector mentioned she'd never seen such well-maintained cattle pens. Then came animal control. Responding to reports of animal cruelty and neglect, the officer spent an hour examining my 35 head of Black Angus cattle and concluded they were some of the healthiest animals she'd seen. She actually asked if I sold beef locally because she wanted to buy some. The Environmental Protection Agency received a complaint about water contamination from runoff. Their tests showed the creek running through my property was cleaner than the municipal water supply. The agent told me Brenda had submitted a 47-page report with charts and graphs that he described as complete fiction dressed up in scientific language. Each failed complaint seemed to make Brenda more determined and more creative. She reported me for noise violations, claiming the cattle were mooing at inappropriate hours. She filed a complaint about dust from my dirt road affecting air quality in Sunset Ridge. She even called the FBI once, claiming she'd seen suspicious activity in my barn at night, which turned out to be me bottle feeding an orphaned calf. The FBI agent who showed up for that one couldn't stop laughing when he realized what he'd been called out for. "Mr. Morrison, I've been with the Bureau for 15 years, and this is definitely a first. That woman wrote a report suggesting you might be running a terrorist training camp because she saw multiple figures moving in darkness around your barn. I had the vet out for a difficult calving," I explained. "It went past midnight, so my ranch hand and I were helping with headlamps." He shook his head, still chuckling. "She included thermal imaging photos from some kind of high-end camera. This lady has way too much time and money on her hands." But Brenda's most ambitious complaint was yet to come. One morning, I woke up to find surveyors tramping across my east pasture with equipment. When I confronted them, they explained that Brenda Hutchinson had filed an official complaint with the county, claiming I had illegally expanded my property boundaries and was encroaching on public land. "She says you've been slowly moving your fence lines over the years," the lead surveyor explained, showing me the work order. "According to her complaint, you've stolen nearly 50 acres of land from various sources." I couldn't help but laugh. "That's ridiculous. These fence lines haven't moved since my grandfather's time. I've got aerial photos from the 1950s that show exactly where everything is." The surveyor nodded sympathetically. "I figured as much. But we've got to do our due diligence. The county takes land disputes seriously, especially when someone files as detailed a complaint as Mrs. Hutchinson did. She included GPS coordinates, historical plat maps, and even hired her own surveyor to create a report." "She hired a surveyor? With whose money?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "According to the paperwork, the Sunset Ridge HOA paid for it. Apparently, she convinced the board it was necessary to protect the community from land encroachment." I spent the next week working with the survey team, providing them with decades of documentation, proving my property lines were exactly where they'd always been. My uncle had been meticulous about maintaining records, and I had everything from the original 1893 land grant to modern GPS surveys done just 5 years ago. What the surveyors discovered during their investigation, however, would change everything. It started with a casual observation from one of the younger surveyors. "Hey, boss, He called out to the lead surveyor one afternoon. "Something's weird about the property line over by the Hutchinson place." I walked over with them to investigate. The surveyor was standing near the elaborate stone wall that separated Brenda's backyard from my property. But as he showed us on his equipment, the wall wasn't where it should be. According to the official plat maps, Mrs. Hutchinson's property line should be about 25 feet closer to her house. He explained, pointing to his tablet. This wall, her pool area, and that entire garden section are all built on land that doesn't belong to her. May have dropped. "Are you saying she built on my land?" The lead surveyor studied the data, cross-referencing multiple sources. "No. It's even more interesting than that. This strip of land belongs to the county. It's part of a utility easement that was established in 1962 for future infrastructure development. Not only did she build on land she doesn't own, but she built on land where construction is specifically prohibited." The investigation that followed was thorough and damning. The survey team discovered that Brenda's beautiful backyard oasis, the one she was constantly posting photos of on the Sunset Ridge Facebook page, was almost entirely built on land she had no right to use. Her pool house, elaborate garden with its fountains and statuary, and even part of her expanded patio were all sitting on county property. Worse, when investigators pulled the construction permits, they found she'd never gotten proper approvals for any of it. She'd listed the improvements as minor landscaping on her permit applications, avoiding the scrutiny that major construction would have triggered. The contractors she'd hired were unlicensed, paid in cash to avoid leaving a paper trail. When the county investigators presented their preliminary findings to me, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. So she spent months trying to prove I was stealing land. And she's the one who actually stole land? The lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Chen, nodded grimly. "It's worse than that. Mr. Morrison, our investigation into her complaints against you led us to examine all the properties in Sunset Ridge. We found similar violations at 3 other homes, all belonging to current or former HOA board members. It appears Mrs. Hutchinson may have been running a scheme to help board members expand their properties onto county land." "Are you serious?" I asked. Stunned by the scope of what they were suggesting, we found emails on the HOA server where she discussed with board members how to maximize property potential by utilizing adjacent, undeveloped areas. She even recommended specific contractors who would work without permits. This goes back at least 7 years. The county wasted no time in taking action. Within a week, Brenda received official notice that she had 30 days to remove all structures from the county land and restore it to its original condition. The cost estimate for demolition and restoration came to $120,000. On top of that, she faced fines totaling $85,000 for various violations, including building without permits, encroaching on public land, and destroying protected vegetation. When Brenda received the notice, her reaction was predictable. She immediately went on the offensive, hiring the most expensive lawyer in the county and threatening to sue everyone involved. She claimed the survey was rigged, that I had bribed officials, and that this was all retaliation for her legitimate concerns about my ranch. Her lawyer, a slick operator named Charles Pemberton, held a press conference on Brenda's perfectly manicured but illegally situated lawn. "My client is the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign," he announced to the assembled local media, "simply because she dared to stand up for her community's property values. She's being targeted by a vindictive neighbor and corrupt county officials." But Brenda's attempts to spin the narrative fell apart when the county released the evidence they'd gathered, the permits she'd filed containing false information, the emails discussing how to circumvent building codes, the canceled checks to unlicensed contractors with cash only written in the memo line, photos showing she'd cut down protected heritage oak trees to make room for her pool. The other HOA board members implicated in the scheme quickly distanced themselves from Brenda. They agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced fines. Their testimonies painted a picture of a woman who'd used her position as HOA president to enrich herself and her allies at the expense of the law. As the 30-day deadline approached, Brenda made increasingly desperate attempts to save her backyard paradise. She tried to organize protests, Claiming the county was overreaching its authority, she attempted to get the state government involved, writing letters to anyone who would listen about the injustice she was facing. She even started a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for her legal defense, which raised a grand total of $215, mostly from her out-of-state relatives. I watched all of this unfold with a mixture of amazement and vindication. The woman who'd made my life miserable for months, who'd weaponized every government agency she could think of against me, was finally facing the consequences of her own actions. But I had no idea just how far she would fall. As the deadline drew closer, Brenda's behavior became increasingly erratic. She fired Charles Pemberton when he advised her to comply with the county's orders, hiring and firing 2 more lawyers in rapid succession. She began showing up at county commissioner meetings, making rambling speeches about conspiracies and persecution. Security had to escort her out of one meeting when she wouldn't stop shouting about her constitutional rights being violated. The Sunset Ridge HOA board called an emergency meeting to address the situation. As a neighboring property owner affected by their president's actions, I was invited to attend. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beautiful building that, ironically, sat properly within the development's actual boundaries. The room was packed with angry homeowners who'd just learned their HOA fees had been used to fund Brenda's illegal activities. The board's treasurer, a mild-mannered accountant named Harold Fitzgerald, presented the financial report with shaking hands. Over the past 7 years, Mrs. Hutchinson has authorized approximately $300,000 in HOA expenditures for what she categorized as community improvement initiatives, Harold explained. We now know much of this money went to legal fees for her various complaints and to pay for surveys and reports that contained false information. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. One homeowner stood up and demanded to know how this could have happened without oversight. Harold looked miserable as he explained that Brenda had consistently blocked attempts to audit the books, claiming it would be a waste of association resources. The board voted unanimously to remove Brenda as president and to pursue legal action to recover the misused funds. They also voted to formally apologize to me for the harassment campaign conducted in their name. It was a satisfying moment. But Brenda wasn't done yet. 2 days before the county's deadline, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of heavy machinery. Looking out my window, I could see lights blazing in Brenda's backyard and the silhouette of an excavator. I threw on some clothes and drove over to see what was happening. What I found was surreal. Brenda was out there in designer pajamas and rubber boots, directing a construction crew in some kind of bizarre middle-of-the-night operation. They weren't removing the illegal structures as ordered. Instead, they were pouring concrete around them, apparently trying to make them permanent fixtures that would be harder to remove. I called the sheriff's department, and within minutes, several patrol cars arrived. The deputies shut down the operation and informed Brenda she was violating the county's order. She broke down in tears, mascara running down her face as she begged them to let her finish. "This is my dream home," she sobbed. "I've put everything into making it perfect. You can't just take it away from me." One of the deputies, showing more patience than I would have, explained that she was the one who'd chosen to build illegally. Her response was to accuse me of orchestrating the whole thing. "He planned this," she screamed, pointing at me. "He knew I would find out about his land theft. So he fabricated all of this to discredit me. Check his background. He's probably not even a real rancher. He's some kind of corporate spy sent to destroy our community." The deputies took her increasingly unhinged accusations in stride, eventually convincing her to go back inside. But the damage was done. The attempted midnight construction had violated the county's order, and the concrete sheet had poured would make the required demolition even more expensive. The next morning, county officials arrived with an updated order. Due to her violation of the original directive and the additional damage caused, Brenda now faced criminal charges for contempt of court and destruction of public property. The fines had doubled, and she was given just 48 hours to vacate the premises entirely. Brenda's sister arrived from Dallas that afternoon, trying to talk sense into her. I could hear the shouting from my property as Brenda refused to accept reality. She barricaded herself inside, posting increasingly deranged messages on social media about government tyranny and vowing to fight to the death for her property rights. It all came to a head on a Thursday morning. The Thursday morning, when everything came to its inevitable conclusion, started with an unusual quiet. I was up at 5 a.m. as always, tending to the cattle, when I noticed the unusual number of vehicles gathering at the end of Brenda's driveway. Sheriff's deputies, county officials, and even a mental health crisis counselor were preparing for what everyone knew would be a difficult eviction. By 7 a.m., a crowd had gathered. Neighbors from Sunset Ridge stood in small groups, whispering among themselves. Some had brought coffee and lawn chairs, treating it like some kind of perverse entertainment. Others looked genuinely concerned. Despite their anger at Brenda for misusing HOA funds, local news vans had also arrived, their reporters doing live broadcasts about the HOA president gone rogue story that had captivated the county. Sheriff Patricia Williams, a veteran officer who'd seen her share of difficult evictions, approached Brenda's front door with 2 deputies. She knocked firmly and announced through a bullhorn that they were there to enforce the evacuation order. For several minutes, there was no response. Then Brenda's voice, hoarse from crying and screaming, came through an upstairs window. "I'm not leaving. This is my home. I have rights. You're all part of Jake Morrison's conspiracy to destroy me." Sheriff Williams remained calm and professional. "Mrs. Hutchinson, you've been given multiple opportunities to comply with legal orders. We don't want anyone to get hurt. Please come out peacefully, and we can handle this with dignity." "Dignity?" Brenda shrieked. "You want to talk about dignity? That man," she pointed at me even though I was standing 100 yards away, "has destroyed everything I've worked for. He's turned everyone against me with his lies and his bribes." I shook my head, amazed at her complete detachment from reality. The truth was, I hadn't needed to do anything. Brenda had destroyed herself with her own greed and vindictiveness. Her obsession with controlling everything around her had led her to break numerous laws, and now she was facing the consequences. The standoff continued for another hour. Brenda alternated between tearful pleas and angry threats, claiming she had evidence of a vast conspiracy involving me, the county government, and even the federal authorities. She said she'd sent copies of this evidence to the Department of Justice, the FBI, and several congressional representatives. Of course, no such evidence existed outside of her increasingly delusional mind. Finally, Sheriff Williams gave the order to enter the house. A locksmith was brought in to open the front door, and deputies entered carefully. Aware that Brenda's mental state was questionable, they found her in her home office, surrounded by boxes of papers, all the evidence she'd compiled against me over the months. She was on the phone with someone, frantically trying to get them to intervene. "Yes, this is Brenda Hutchinson," she was saying. "I need to speak to the governor immediately. There's a criminal conspiracy happening in Cedar Valley, and I'm about to be illegally evicted as part of the cover-up." "What do you mean he won't take my call? Don't you understand? This goes all the way to the top." When she saw the deputy, she dropped the phone and grabbed a stack of papers, holding them like a shield. "Stay back. I have proof. Proof that Jake Morrison is running an illegal operation. He's probably trafficking drugs through that barn. Why else would he refuse to paint it a normal color?" The mental health counselor stepped forward, speaking in soothing tones, trying to calm Brenda down. It took another 30 minutes of gentle negotiation before she finally agreed to leave the house voluntarily. Though she insisted on being allowed to take her evidence with her, as she was escorted out, Brenda looked nothing like the polished, controlling HOA president I'd first met. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled and stained. Her eyes had a wild look that spoke of someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. She clutched a box of papers to her chest like it was a life preserver. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she was led to a sheriff's vehicle, but before they could get her in the car, she broke free and ran toward me, her heels clicking on the pavement. The deputies quickly caught up to her, but not before she got close enough to scream one last accusation. "You did this," she wailed, mascara streaming down her face. "You and your ugly red barn, you've destroyed my life. I hope you're happy. Jake Morrison, I hope you're satisfied with ruining a pillar of this community." As the deputies gently but firmly guided her back to the car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was vindication, certainly, but also a kind of sadness. This woman had let her need for control and her prejudice against my ranch consume her to the point of self-destruction. If she'd just left me alone, she'd still be in her home, still be HOA president, still have her illegal backyard paradise that no one would have discovered. The next few hours were surreal. Moving trucks arrived to pack up Brenda's belongings under the supervision of county officials. Everything had to be documented and inventoried. As much of it might be seized to pay her mounting fines and legal fees, workers began the careful process of demolishing the illegal structures in her backyard, starting with the beautiful stone fountain that had been the centerpiece of her garden. Harold Fitzgerald, the former HOA treasurer, approached me as I watched from my property line. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to apologize again for everything the association put you through. We had no idea Brenda was using our resources for her personal vendetta." I appreciated his apology, but I was more interested in learning how things had gotten so out of control. How did she manage to hide all of this for so long? Harold sighed, looking embarrassed. She was very clever about it. She'd present things to the board in ways that made them seem reasonable. The survey of your property? She told us you were planning to build a commercial development that would destroy our property values. The various complaints? She said they were protective measures to maintain community standards. We trusted her. And we shouldn't have. What happens to the HOA now? I asked. We're holding emergency elections next week. Several residents have already volunteered to run, and they're all talking about transparency and better neighbor relations. I think this whole disaster might actually lead to positive changes. He paused, then added, we're also looking into how many other HOAs she might have influenced. Turns out she was part of a national organization of HOA presidents who shared tactics for maintaining community standards. There might be similar situations in other neighborhoods. That revelation didn't surprise me. Brenda's level of organization and her knowledge of which agencies to contact suggested she'd had training or at least communication with others who operated the same way. I wondered how many other innocent property owners had been harassed by HOA presidents following Brenda's playbook. As the day wore on, more disturbing information came to light. Investigators searching Brenda's home office found detailed files on dozens of residents, not just from Sunset Ridge but from surrounding neighborhoods as well. She had photos, personal information, and notes about potential violations she could use against anyone who opposed her. My file was the thickest, containing hundreds of photos of my property taken from various angles, many clearly shot from a drone. Detective Marcus Chen from the county sheriff's office showed me some of what they'd found. This goes beyond normal HOA business, he said, flipping through pages of surveillance photos. This is stalking behavior. She has photos of you taken at all hours, notes about your daily routine, even pictures of your mail. We're looking at potential criminal charges beyond the property violations. The files also revealed the extent of Brenda's scheme with other board members. She had helped at least 5 different households expand onto county land over the years, always using the same unlicensed contractors and avoiding permits. In exchange, these board members had supported her increasingly aggressive tactics against anyone she deemed undesirable. It was a web of corruption that had turned what should have been a simple homeowners association into something resembling a criminal organization. By late afternoon, Brenda's house was empty, and the demolition of her backyard structures was well underway. The beautiful pool where she'd hosted HOA board meetings was being drained, its elegant tile work soon to be jackhammered into rubble. The elaborate garden, with its rare plants and expensive landscaping, was being cleared, the land to be restored to its natural state. I learned from Detective Chen that Brenda had been taken for psychiatric evaluation after her arrest. Her sister had provided information about a history of controlling behavior and paranoid tendencies that had worsened over the years. Apparently, becoming HOA president had given her a sense of power that fed into these tendencies, creating a cycle where she needed more and more control to feel secure. The criminal charges against her were serious. Beyond the property violations and misuse of HOA funds, she faced charges for filing false reports, stalking, and conspiracy to defraud the county. Her real estate license, which she'd used to present herself as an authority on property matters, was immediately suspended pending a full investigation. The state real estate board was particularly interested in whether she'd used her position to manipulate property values for personal gain. 3 days after the eviction, I received a call from Brenda's attorney, her fourth one in as many weeks. He wanted to discuss a potential settlement where I would drop any civil claims in exchange for Brenda agreeing not to contact me again. I found it ironic that she was now seeking the kind of peaceful resolution she could have had from the beginning if she'd just left my ranch alone. I agreed to meet with the attorney, a tired-looking man named David Nguyen, who seemed exhausted by his client. "Mr. Morrison," he began, "I want to be clear that I've advised my client to take responsibility for her actions and focus on minimizing the criminal penalties she faces. However, she insists that there's been a misunderstanding and that if you would just agree to paint your barn a different color, she would consider the matter resolved." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. She's facing potential jail time, hundreds of thousands in fines, and she's lost her home. But she's still worried about the color of my barn? David shrugged wearily. She's not entirely in touch with reality at the moment. The psychiatric evaluation suggested she's suffering from a severe adjustment disorder with paranoid features. The loss of control has essentially broken her worldview. She can't accept that her actions had consequences. So she's fixated on the original issue, as if resolving it would make everything go back to normal. I felt that strange mix of vindication and pity again. What's going to happen to her? Best case scenario? She pleads guilty to the lesser charges, gets probation and mandated therapy, pays what fines she can, and tries to rebuild her life somewhere else. Worst case? She continues to fight, goes to trial, and could face up to 5 years in prison for the combined charges. Her sister is trying to get her to accept the plea deal, but Brenda keeps insisting she wants her day in court to expose what she calls the conspiracy. I declined to pursue any civil action against Brenda, feeling she had enough problems without me adding to them. But I made it clear that any future contact or harassment would result in immediate legal action. David assured me that would be communicated clearly to his client, though he couldn't guarantee she would comply, given her mental state. The story of Brenda's downfall became something of a cautionary tale in the area. The local newspaper ran a series of articles about HOA overreach and the importance of oversight in community organizations. Several other neighborhoods began reviewing their own HOA practices, discovering similar, though less extreme issues with board members exceeding their authority. The new Sunset Ridge HOA board, elected in a special election with record turnout, immediately implemented reforms. They established term limits for board positions, required monthly financial audits, and created a community liaison position specifically to maintain good relations with neighboring properties. The new president, a retired teacher named Maria Santos, made a point of visiting me personally to apologize and establish a positive relationship. "We want to be good neighbors," Maria said as we stood by the property line where I'd first met Brenda. "Your ranch is part of what makes this area special." The old board lost sight of that, but we won't make the same mistake. I appreciated her words and was glad to see the community moving in a positive direction. The new board even voted to reimburse me for legal fees I'd incurred defending against Brenda's false complaints, though I declined the offer, feeling the situation had resolved itself in a way that was payment enough. 6 weeks after the eviction, I received an unexpected piece of mail. It was a postcard from Brenda, postmarked from Austin, where she was staying with her sister. The message was brief but telling. "I still think your barn is ugly, but I suppose it doesn't matter anymore. B." I kept the postcard as a reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control when someone lets their need for control consume them. The barn, of course, remained its traditional red, a color it had worn proudly for over 80 years and would continue to wear for many more. The legal proceedings against Brenda continued for several months. She eventually accepted a plea deal that included 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and mandatory psychological counseling. She was also required to pay restitution to the HOA for the misused funds, though it was unclear how she would manage that given her financial situation. Her house in Sunset Ridge was sold at auction to cover the fines and demolition costs, with any remaining funds going to her creditors. I heard through the grapevine that she'd found work as a receptionist at a law firm in Austin, a far cry from her previous life as a real estate agent and HOA president. Her sister reported that she was complying with her therapy requirements but still struggled to accept responsibility for what had happened. She apparently maintained that the whole situation could have been avoided if I had just been a reasonable neighbor and painted my barn beige. The demolition and restoration of the illegally developed county land was completed by fall. Where Brenda's elaborate pool and garden had once stood, native grasses and wildflowers now grew. The county installed a small historical marker explaining the significance of the utility easement and the importance of respecting public lands. It didn't mention Brenda by name, but locals knew the story behind it. My ranch continued to operate as it always had. Though now with notably less drama from the neighbors, the cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures. The red barn stood proud against the Texas sky, and life returned to the quiet rhythm it had followed for generations. Occasionally, new residents of Sunset Ridge would ask about the marker or the story behind the reformed HOA, and neighbors would share the cautionary tale of the president who tried to control everything and lost it all. One autumn evening, as I was repairing the same section of fence where I'd first met Brenda, Maria Santos stopped by with a proposal. The HOA wanted to organize educational visits for local schools to learn about ranching and agricultural heritage. Would I be willing to host these visits and share the history of the land? I agreed. Thinking it was a fitting way to build bridges between the old and new communities, the first school visit was scheduled for the following month, and I spent time preparing displays about the ranch's history and the importance of agricultural preservation. The morning of the first school tour, as I was setting up in the barn, I noticed something that made me smile. A group of Sunset Ridge kids had made a banner to hang on the barn door. It read, "Welcome to Morrison Ranch, home of the famous Red Barn." The barn that Brenda had called an eyesore had become a beloved landmark. As I welcomed the eager young students and began telling them about the ranch's history, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. Brenda's campaign against my property had ultimately resulted in stronger community bonds, better governance, and a renewed appreciation for the agricultural heritage of the area. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempts to force conformity had instead highlighted the value of diversity and tradition. Her illegal expansion onto public land, while accusing me of property violations, had exposed corruption and led to reforms. Her use of HOA funds to harass me had resulted in transparency measures that would benefit residents for years to come. I thought about Brenda occasionally, wondering if she ever recognized the role her own actions had played in her downfall. The psychiatric reports suggested she might never fully accept responsibility, forever trapped in a narrative where she was the victim of a conspiracy rather than the architect of her own destruction. It was a sad fate, but one entirely of her own making. The tours became a regular monthly event, with children from all over the county coming to learn about ranching, local history, and the importance of respecting both private property and public lands. Some of the Sunset Ridge residents volunteered to help building bridges between the suburban and rural communities that had once seemed so at odds. One day, nearly a year after Brenda's eviction, I received a letter from her sister. She wrote that Brenda was doing better, though she still struggled with accepting what had happened. She joined a support group for people with control issues and was slowly learning to let go of her need to manage everything around her. The sister thanked me for not pursuing civil charges and for handling the situation with more grace than Brenda had shown. I wrote back, wishing Brenda well in her recovery and hoping she could find peace. I meant it sincerely. While her actions had caused me months of stress and harassment, they had also led to positive changes I couldn't have anticipated. The ranch was now more connected to the community than ever, and the neighbors who had once viewed it with suspicion now saw it as a valuable part of their heritage. The Red Barn stood as a symbol of that transformation, unchanged, despite Brenda's demands, yet now embraced by the very community she had tried to turn against it. It was a reminder that sometimes the things we try hardest to control are the very things that need to remain free, and that true community isn't built on conformity, but on mutual respect and understanding. As I finished the fence repair that evening, the sun setting behind the barn in a blaze of orange and red that would have undoubtedly offended Brenda's sense of proper color coordination, I felt a deep satisfaction. The ranch would continue for another generation at least. The barn would remain proudly red, and the lessons learned from one woman's obsessive need for control would hopefully prevent similar situations in the future. The sound of cattle lowing in the distance, mixed with the laughter of children from Sunset Ridge playing in their yards. A harmony that spoke of communities learning to coexist. It was exactly the kind of peaceful resolution that could have existed from the beginning. If only Brenda had been able to see beyond her need to control everything around her. Instead, her legacy was one of cautionary example, a reminder of what happens when someone mistakes authority for ownership and position for power. The ranch endured, as it always had, a testament to the strength of tradition and the importance of standing firm against those who would try to force their vision on others. And somewhere in Austin, a woman who had once ruled her domain with an iron fist was learning, slowly and painfully, the hardest lesson of all, that true power comes not from controlling others, but from controlling yourself. 2 years after Brenda's dramatic eviction, life around Cedar Valley had settled into a new normal that would have been unimaginable during her reign of terror. The ranch had become something of a local landmark, featured in Texas Monthly magazine as an example of agricultural preservation in the face of suburban expansion. The article included a prominent photo of the red barn with the caption, "The barn that started a revolution," which I had framed and hung in my office. The educational programs we'd started with local schools had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. What began as simple farm tours had evolved into a full agricultural education partnership with 3 school districts. We'd even received a state grant to build a small educational center where kids could learn about sustainable farming, animal husbandry, and land conservation. The center was painted, naturally, in traditional barn red, a detail that made me smile every time I saw it. One morning, as I was preparing for a group of 5th graders from Austin, Maria Santos stopped by with some news that caught me completely off guard. "Jake, you're not going to believe this," she said, holding up a real estate magazine. "Look who's advertising property in the area." There, in a quarter-page ad, was Brenda Hutchinson's professional headshot alongside text promoting her services as a community standards consultant, specializing in HOA, optimization and property value protection. According to the ad, she was now based in San Antonio but serving the entire Central Texas region. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, reading through her list of services, which included strategic violation identification and aesthetic compliance enforcement. It seemed Brenda had found a way to monetize her obsessive need for control, turning her HOA presidency debacle into a consulting career. Maria shook her head in disbelief. The woman gets evicted from her home for illegal construction and HOA fund misuse. And now she's selling herself as an expert on proper HOA management? The audacity is breathtaking. A week later, I learned from Harold Fitzgerald that Brenda had actually approached several HOAs in the region, pitching her services with a carefully sanitized version of her experience. She presented herself as a former president who had identified critical compliance issues and championed property standards against commercial encroachment. Nowhere in her marketing materials did she mention the criminal charges, the psychiatric evaluation, or the small detail of losing her home due to her own illegal activities. Most associations apparently saw through her pitch, but incredibly, 2 small HOAs in the San Antonio suburbs had actually hired her as a consultant. I could only imagine what kind of chaos she was creating there. Armed with her clipboards and color swatches, hunting for violations and eyesores to document. But the final blow came when the Texas Real Estate Commission, which had been monitoring her activities, formally revoked her license permanently. She had been operating under a suspended license, which violated the terms of her probation. This meant she faced potential jail time for the violation. I learned about all of this through the legal grapevine. David Nguyen, her former attorney, had lunch with my lawyer and shared what had become of his most difficult client. According to him, Brenda had suffered a complete breakdown when her consulting business failed. She'd been found by San Antonio police standing outside a Home Depot at 2 a.m, spray painting color swatches on the exterior wall and screaming about improper shade selection. She was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment, and her sister had to take temporary guardianship. The last anyone heard, she was living in a court-ordered residential treatment facility, where ironically, She had no control over any aspect of her environment, not the wall colors, not the landscaping, not even her daily schedule. The woman who had needed to control everything now controlled nothing. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Valley, the positive changes sparked by Brenda's downfall continued to ripple outward. The Sunset Ridge HOA had become a model for responsible community governance, even hosting workshops for other associations on transparency and neighbor relations. They'd instituted an annual Heritage Day celebrating the area's agricultural history. With my ranch as the centerpiece of the festivities, the Red Barn had become such a beloved local landmark that when a storm damaged part of the roof, the Sunset Ridge HOA actually volunteered to help fund repairs, insisting it be restored to exactly the same shade of red. Maria Santos personally delivered a check, joking that they needed to preserve the barn that had saved their community from tyranny. During one of the school tours, a fourth-grade teacher pulled me aside with an interesting connection. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I thought you should know, one of my students wrote an essay about your barn for our local history project." She interviewed her grandmother, who remembered when your grandfather built it. According to her, he specifically chose that bright red color to thumb his nose at the bank. President who said farmers had no sense of style. As I write this, sitting on my porch looking out at the Red Barn that started it all, I'm struck by how one person's obsession with control led to so many positive changes: the stronger HOA governance, the community education programs, the restored public lands, the connections between rural and suburban neighbors. None of it would have happened if Brenda had just minded her own business.